afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the International Union of Forest Research Organizations and the members of the Global Forest Expert Panel on Biodiversity, Forest Management, and REDD+, I would like to thank the hosts of Forest Day 6, and in particular the International Center for Forestry Research for this opportunity to speak to you today. As a proposed mechanism for climate change mitigation, REDD+ has the potential to realize its primary climate change mitigation objective with variable impacts, both positive and negative, on biodiversity, forests, and people. REDD+ is complex. Its proposed activities and implementation mechanisms are not yet clearly defined, and therefore surrounded by uncertainty. Because of its high relevance to climate change mitigation, the conservation and sustainable use of forests and their biological diversity, the Collaborative Partnership on Forests established an expert panel on biodiversity, forest management, and REDD+ a year ago during the last climate COP in Durban, South Africa. The Global Forest Expert Panel initiative of the CPF is led and coordinated by IUFRO. This initiative supports forest-related intergovernmental processes by assessing available scientific information in a comprehensive, interdisciplinary, objective, open, and transparent way, and produces reports on issues of high concern. The objectives of this particular expert panel were first, to carry out a comprehensive assessment of the available scientific information about the linkages between biodiversity, carbon, and forest management in the context of REDD+. And secondly, to prepare a report for consideration at the UNFCCC COP18 meeting, the CBD COP11 meeting, which was last month, and for use at the UNFF at its 10th session, as well as by other forest-related international processes. The expert panel drew on the expertise of over 40 renowned scientists from around the world from a variety of biophysical and social science disciplines that are relevant to the topics covered in this assessment. The full report and its individual chapters were peer-reviewed by another 16 scientific experts prior to publication. The report evaluates the implications of forest and land management interventions envisaged under REDD+. It analyzes the most current scientific literature that sheds light on the relationships between forest biodiversity and carbon sequestration, how these complex relationships may be affected by management activities implemented to achieve REDD objectives, the potential synergies and trade-offs between environmental and socioeconomic objectives, and their relationship to governance issues. In addition to synthesizing the existing scientific knowledge on these topics, we identify areas of uncertainty and/or risk and how these might be reduced. In doing so, the assessment report seeks to strengthen the scientific basis for informed decision-making by policymakers, investors, donors, and other interested stakeholders with respect to REDD+ implementation. Based on the main findings of the assessment, a policy brief entitled REDD+, Biodiversity and People, Opportunities and Risks, which was included in everybody's packet for this event, summarizes the key findings of the full assessment report. The structure of the report was conceptualized as a progression of building blocks which begins with the ecological fundamentals of forests as they relate to biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and other ecosystem services. The report then explores the different forest management options under REDD+, and seeks to highlight their main biodiversity and carbon impacts. It then considers the socioeconomic dimensions of these forest-related interventions, and finally reviews the governance underpinnings of REDD+. Specifically, Chapter 2 of the full report examines the role of biodiversity in the provision of ecosystem goods and services, and describes the forest types of key interest to REDD+. It provides an overview of biodiversity and carbon relationships across the range of forest types occurring in regions where REDD+ initiatives and programs may be developed. It also considers the impacts of deforestation and degradation on carbon and other ecosystem services. Chapter 3 of the report explores the impacts on biodiversity and carbon of the various management approaches and specific actions that are likely to be employed to achieve REDD objectives. It considers the circumstances under which management activities may have positive impacts on both biodiversity and carbon, and the evidence regarding linkages, synergies, and trade-offs between carbon and biodiversity objectives associated with their implementation. The chapter also examines key considerations for the design and implementation of monitoring and assessment processes, including selection of appropriate indicators to measure and report on changes in both carbon and biodiversity. A wide range of forest management approaches and actions can potentially contribute to the 5 broad activities under the developing REDD+ mechanism, and many can support more than one of these REDD activities, as shown in this table. They include approaches directed at preventing adverse human impacts on forests, reducing those impacts, and accelerating the rate of forest recovery. In our assessment, we examined a variety of management actions that may potentially form a part of REDD+ programs and strategies. These actions were considered under 5 broad categories: improving agricultural practices, forest protection measures, reducing impacts of extractive use, forest restoration and reforestation, and landscape scale planning and coordination. Chapter 4 of the main report examines social and economic considerations related to REDD+. It highlights the role of mediating factors such as governance structures and the exercise of authority, rules and institutions for resource management, and tenure and property rights regimes, with a special focus on the most vulnerable groups. It examines the social and economic impacts of deforestation and forest degradation, and reviews the experiences and socioeconomic outcomes of previous agricultural and forest-based interventions. This chapter discusses decentralization and participatory forms of forest governance and management, drawing particularly on the experience with payment for ecosystem services, schemes, and forest certification. Chapter 5 examines the broad array of governance instruments of direct relevance to forests, carbon, and biodiversity in the context of REDD+. It analyzes how different actors, interests, and ideas are shaping that landscape. It considers how intergovernmental processes have generated few binding commitments and favored strategies that enhance sovereign authority, while non-state actors have spearheaded market-based mechanisms and pressured financial institutions to develop environmental and social safeguards. International policy options are assessed as to how these might foster synergies between REDD+ and biodiversity protection. The chapter concludes with an examination of the intersection of international forest governance and national and local agendas, and conflicting pressures for international standardization, sovereignty, and local autonomy, illustrated by case studies from Brazil, the Congo Basin, and Nepal. Finally, Chapter 6 of the report provides a synthesis of the main findings of the assessment, including areas identified as requiring further research. I'd like to just review some of the key findings from the report. First, biodiversity is a key determinant of forests' ability to effectively provide ecosystem services, notably carbon sequestration, and to remain resilient in the face of disturbances such as climate change. To optimize long-term carbon sequestration benefits and provide forest ecosystem services, management activities should be carried out such that forest ecosystems remain under what might be termed a safe operating space. Second key message, the most immediate and greatest benefits for both carbon and biodiversity are likely to come from actions that seek to reduce deforestation and forest degradation. To put it very simply, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. REDD actions can have highly variable impacts, both positive and negative, on carbon and biodiversity at different spatial and temporal scales. These impacts are likely to vary significantly across different forest types and landscape conditions, and may occur outside the area of management or in the future and can evolve over time. Trade-offs between carbon and biodiversity outcomes should be evaluated at both local and wider spatial scales, for example, at the landscape scale. Since there is no one-size-fits-all approach, development of regionally tailored strategies for REDD+ are a major priority for future research. Pursuing social objectives alongside REDD+ will also increase the likelihood of achieving carbon and biodiversity goals. The way in which REDD+ is implemented will determine its social and economic impacts. The evidence suggests that evaluation and consideration of impacts on people should be included very early on in REDD+ planning and implementation. For REDD+ implementation to be effective, tenure and property rights, including rights of access, use, and ownership, need to be clear. The evidence shows that security of tenure and associated authority for local decision-making support better environmental management, as well as the realization of livelihood benefits. Therefore, clarifying and securing these rights is critical to the sustainability of REDD+ activities. An integrated landscape management approach provides a useful tool to reconcile environmental, social, and economic considerations under REDD+. Planning and implementing REDD+ within a landscape scale helps to define and address trade-offs. Such an approach helps to ensure that the interests of the most vulnerable groups are adequately taken into account and increases the likelihood of achieving long-lasting climate mitigation goals. There is a tension among REDD+ efforts aimed at international standardization, the strengthening of national sovereignty, and efforts to empower local communities as key actors in REDD+. Efforts to promote REDD+ safeguards at the international level may either complement or constrain national sovereignty and local autonomy. Without sufficient emphasis on local participation, there is a risk that REDD+ could re-centralize government decision-making and undermine community-based forest governance. There is much to be learned from initiatives and governance arrangements that are already working. Understanding the relationship between biodiversity, carbon, forests, and people is the key to achieving REDD+ objectives. Understanding these relationships, the governance context, and related constraints in which they occur is essential to inform appropriate management actions. While much is known about many of these relationships, there are significant gaps in our knowledge on various aspects of REDD+ that should be addressed as a matter of priority for effective implementation of REDD+ and related forest management interventions. In closing, we wish to thank our donors for their support and all of you for your kind attention. Shukran.
Thank you very much to John Perrotta for summarizing many excellent scientists from the global network of IUFRO in putting all this information together and presenting it here. We have now invited 4 panelists, and the idea was that those 4 panelists should reflect on this report, which they've had some time to look through. And the first one is Dr. Horst Freiberg, who is head of Division Forest Conservation, Sustainable Forest Management, Biological Diversity, and Climate Change, the huge division, Horst, at the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety in Bonn, Germany. Horst is a forest engineer, graduated from Forestry faculty in Munich. Now, Horst, when you, as one of the donor countries for REDD+, have read and looked through this policy brief, what do you consider the most relevant findings?
For introducing me. Yes, a huge division, a name. I always abbreviate that in our ministry. It's the forest division in the Ministry of Environment. So it makes it very, 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 very short. And as donor, one of those who supported the study, which we loved to support, because the 3 issues, REDD+, biodiversity, and people, is for us as a ministry one of our major political issues which we would like to bring together. What we would expect, and this was what we really loved and liked in that, with that study, is that you brought together a variety of over 40 scientists, cross over all disciplines, And we are very aware about that this is needed to cross over natural sciences to social sciences, to bring all these different aspects into this, I think, important link between these three different names, but also bring these together on the landscape level. And this was our motivation to support that study. What we expected and what we take out from that study is that, of course, three things, I think, for us at least, which guides our work, is that you need a multi-level governance which is consistent on the international, national, and local level. I think this is important. So what we decide on an international level has to be consistent down to national and local level. So everybody has to understand what comes down from highest levels, what we sit here in Doha actually negotiating, and what comes down to the ground, which has to be understood, and this has to be consistent. The second point I think is important, what we heard in the introduction today, in the opening, which we believe is very, very clear, that you have to think together ecological, social, and economic aspects into one thing. Without environment and a safe and a good environment, you cannot develop any society or social activities, nor you can develop your economy. And there are very interesting and international examples who can prove that this is the case. And many countries, what I know, I have worked also 8 years in the developing world in Latin America in forest projects. This is, I think, a critical aspect, and the study, for us at least, reflects this very clear, and it is for us a good reference that this is something which we have to reflect and which we have to politically at least support and look for it. And the third, it is something what I see is from our national experiences, and I'm a forester, and I've worked also in the National Forest Service in Germany for a couple of years. We have a proverb in German which says, das eiserne Gesetz des Örtlichen, which means, if I translate that into something which can be understood, is the iron law which respects the local conditions. I think this is also something which is needed in all these discussions, to look on the ground, on the landscape level, which I think it is not a new, but in the combination of what you have shown today here, is an innovative and a leading concept for the future, I think. And it is important, but to respect and adapt all the concepts down to the local level. Because without the local people on the ground, you will never have a chance to implement such a concept. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's give a hand. Our next panelist is Tasso Azevedo, who is a forest and climate change consultant and a social entrepreneur. He is former Director General of the Brazilian Forest Service. And in that context, he has also been founder and director of the IUFRO. So, Tasso Azevedo, what do you see as the biggest challenge for REDD Plus implementation in REDD Plus countries with regard to biodiversity, conservation, and people's livelihood?
Okay. Well, I think I will reflect on something that we were talking on the lunch right now.
Yes, please.
I think probably one of the conclusions that I think it's missing on the report, maybe could be the 9th conclusion, would be start with whatever you get. Because one thing that I'm seeing now, it's everybody starting to do their plans, the national REDD strategy and so on. Take 2 years designing something, trying to understand the whole thing. You need to understand everything before you actually have a plan. And after you have this big plan, then you start to operate. Our experience that this don't work. What needs to be done is find out 2, 3 things that are key and important and start to act. Plan, that's very good. Start to plan together, but start to act first. When we actually got the plan to combat deforestation in Brazil, that was back in 2004, we were able to do that because actually 1 year before, we have focused on one thing that we thought that would be a big thing for us, which was fight corruption. Because most of the deforestation was illegal, where there is illegality, there is corruption. And we look up for something that was significant and said mahogany. Let's just stop this damn mahogany market, fighting corruption. And that was, I mean, I will not tell the whole story, but there's no market anymore for mahogany in Brazil. That's basically, we were fighting this specifically. Because we have this experience and we have action, we were able to look at the problem as something more real and tangible when we were actually doing the planning. So if there is one thing that maybe we're losing the time now, the timing for doing the action, is that we are spending too much time on thinking and planning and designing strategies and so on to be, I mean, just to have an idea, there is no strategy for REDD in Brazil yet. I mean, the people are there discussing national strategy for REDD. It's not even important because who cares about the national strategy for REDD? What you have is actions in the ground to tackle the problems that you face day by day. And as you learn, you start to, figure out what's the best way to do the next step and so on and so on. Because I think it's very dynamic. So I'm not against planning, but I think that we are too focused on this idea that we have to have a strategy, and we are losing the time that we need to actually make actions on the day by day in the field. Another good way to see that is that we have inventories for forests for emissions in Brazil. For every four years you have the national inventory and so on. But what we need is we need to know what's going on with the emissions in Brazil right now. So let's just have estimations. I mean, I don't care if it has 5% difference from the final result. What we need to know is where we are going. Does it go up, down, to the right, to the left? So it's the same thing as information about, how much is the emissions from deforestation and how we're tuning, how much biomass you have. Really doesn't matter. What it matters is that if you decrease deforestation, if you decrease degradation, you have a good result. Let's do this first, and after you can measure whatever we want to measure in details. So my point here is, if we want to save REDD as a result, not as a process, because I don't think REDD is a process or a mechanism, REDD is a result. Reduce emissions from deforestation, forest degradation. If you want to get that, if you want to keep that, if you don't want to lose that, we have to focus more on the actions right now of what we can do and less on the whole story of understanding the whole thing.
Focus on the action. Thank you. Our next panelist is Dr. Valerie Kappers, who is working for the United Nations Environmental Program, the World Conservation Monitoring Center. Valerie Kappers is a tropical forest ecologist with extensive field experience in Latin America and the Caribbean. Most recently, she has worked on the links between biodiversity and climate change policy, including REDD+, and in this aspect, she has been one of the leading author of this assessment here. Now, Valerie, as coordinating lead author of the assessment, is there some kind of blueprint for delivering the optimal outcomes for carbon, biodiversity, and people? Could you give us the optimum blueprint?
No. That's the short answer. The slightly longer answer is that it's very clear from everything my colleagues have said that action is fundamental and that achieving REDD objectives will depend on a whole diversity of actions. And one of the things that came clearly out of our discussions in drafting the report were that the great diversity of actions have a great diversity of outcomes, and that despite TASA's objection to planning, I would argue that there's a certain necessity to try to decide on some desirable outcomes, and then to consider and to build, to some degree, a conceptual model and a scientific understanding and a practical understanding based on on-the-ground experience of what the likely outcomes of particular management actions will be. To therefore plan and indeed implement in an integrated fashion, trying to address a series of objectives, make an effort to anticipate both risks and benefits from those actions, and try to foresee the best possible ways of improving benefits, mitigating risks. And finally, and most importantly, we thought it was critical to raise the importance of actually assessing as you go along, exploring the impacts of those management actions that are being taken, their effectiveness, and possibly their side effects, and then to be able to reflect and manage adaptively and adjust plans and programs. We mustn't, as Tasso says, plan ourselves into oblivion. We must also not have a plan and stick to it to the point that we have impacts that we haven't yet anticipated. I think that would be my blueprint. So identify risks and benefits, tie those to actions, prioritize actions in relation to desired benefits, and monitor the results and adjust, fine-tune. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie, for giving us, anyhow, some kind of blueprint for moving ahead, doing some actions. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Robert Nassi, who is director of the CDIR Consortium Research Program on Forest, Trees, and Agroforestry, Livelihoods, Landscape, and Governance. Robert Nassi has been working in CIFOR since August 1999 and is very experienced in this field of working. So, Robert, what should be the next steps towards an effective REDD+ implementation, integrating biodiversity and socioeconomic considerations? And what is the role of science since you are director of this huge program in the CDR consortium?
Thank you, Niels. I mean, I thought the question was pretty unfair when I was shown. I think that it's unfair to try to answer this question, but I'll try to give it a go. So, if you bear with me, I'm basically a forest ecologist, so I will really walk on paths that are out of my comfort zone here. But fundamentally, if we assume that we will solve the issue related to development of the big REDD mechanism, whatever it will be or whatever form or whenever it will be, what can science bring to the debate in order to do what Tasso says, I mean, it's having some results? And what is the role of science? I mean, the role of science, the fundamental role of science is to generate knowledge, and is to inform the debate so that decision maker and society can take the best decision, or if they take a decision that may not be the best, they know what will be the consequences. So, in this issue of biodiversity, REDD, people, livelihood, there are many questions that still need to be answered by science or research. I mean, if we relate to the biophysical or ecological issue, I would say that my main question will be, what is the good entry point? Is it looking for carbon or more broadly to ecosystem? I mean, there is some empirical evidence, but not enough, that if you use an ecosystem or a landscape-based approach, for the same amount of money, you will store the same amount of carbon, but you will save more endangered species and more endangered ecosystem. So what do we want? Do we want to go for carbon, or do we want to go for ecosystem and at the same time sequester carbon? We have a few examples, but not enough, so we need to have more in different ecosystems. Other issues, the issue of biodiversity and resilience. How many species do you need? 275 or 352 or 2, 3? So we are still missing this data, and it's very important because with resilience comes permanence of your storage. If you store a hell of a lot of carbon with a monoclonal plantation, and if a disease struck your plantation, you have lost whatever you wanted to do. So this is still something where science has to bring something. The same for this issue of forest and tree cover and the mesoscale circulation of water. What is the impact? And one important point, and it's in a country like Doha, is that the recognition of the importance of the dry forest, the dry lands, because it's something that is largely ignored in the REDD debate. And it's largely ignored because if you look at the paper published by scientists, I mean, thousands of papers about Amazon or the Congo Basin on the rainforest, and you have a very little die-hard people that are working on the dry lands, but it's still not enough. Now, going to places where I don't really know, which is about governance, socio-economic issue, I mean, for me, the main question is financing, and that's who pays, who benefits, and how do we finance? And it's not only about money, it's about working with the people to co-develop or to have co-agreed goals so that we know where we want to go, and when we want to go, we go there. And then you have some issues that are not necessarily always taken care of, but are very important, that the role of trade and investment, and some of the macroeconomic factors. I mean, there is a recent study that shows that probably 50% of the change in deforestation rate is simply due to currency exchange rates. It's not about public policy or whatever. It's the change between the US dollar or the price of cocoa that makes something different. And then you have the growing importance of the emerging economy. I mean, a sort of what will happen when China, India, Brazil, Russia, Indonesia will invest heavily south-south. And the importance of trade-embedded emission. In 2020, people think that the trade-embedded emission will be higher than the land use change emission. Who is working on that? I mean, I think as scientists, we should tackle this problem. So in summary, I mean, I would say for me, we need to develop this multifunctional sustainable landscape because we have these conflicting goals of reducing greenhouse gases emission, improving food security, improving nutrition and health, and sustainably managing the resource. So the good news is it's very easy to say or to articulate. I could write that in one sentence. The bad news is, by and large, we don't know how to do it. So, but we know enough to start. So it's very important. I mean, you know, as scientists, we have a tendency to do, oh, we need further research, which is normally something that the donor don't like very much. But I think we know enough to start and to do something. But it's really a matter of common sense and wanting to do it. And this morning, when I was doing that, I had a good friend from ICRAF. He took me the tablet and he wrote blah, blah, blah. So I won't say who it is, but fundamentally, to finish, let's do it. Let's try to develop the way to manage this multifunctional landscape to provide ecosystem services, livelihoods, and to sequester carbon or to reduce emission, even if we know what we are doing is not perfect. Because if we wait to have the perfect solution, we are all going to die.
Thank you very much, Robert. We have now plenty of time for questions, and I'm going to move up here so I can see those people sitting in the right side of this huge plenum hall here. So who would be the first one to put questions to our chair of the panel or to the four panelists? The chair of the, yes, please, over there in the white shirt. Please say your name and where you're from.
Good afternoon. I'm Michael Bucchi from the European Commission. I would like to thank you all for the report first and for your comments on the report. I think it's a landmark to recognize the importance of non-carbon aspects in the ultimate result of sustainable mitigation in REDD+. And to pick up on the idea of acting now, we have many negotiators in this room who tomorrow and next week will negotiate about how to make REDD+ financing effective on the ground. And therefore, I wondered whether you had thought about concrete ways to include these aspects beyond carbon into the incentive system for REDD+. Whether you had ideas for how to use the information that can be qualitative or quantitative on non-carbon aspects and how to make it part of an effective incentive system at international level.
Let's take one more question that was not just next to you. Yes.
I'm Dedi Adrianto from Indonesia. Congratulations with this very important book. Talking about the biodiversity is also talking about the conservation. And more fundamentally, I think we need to talk about the spatial planning. In many cases, in our situation in Indonesia, the spatial planning is not necessarily environmentally green. So in some cases also it is more politically driven. So do you, how do you consider about the spatial planning in supporting the REDD implementation as well as the biodiversity conservation? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone from the panel who wants to respond? You can see in the panel here it's rather difficult to see because of the light. So. Yes, Valerie?
I can respond on spatial planning. I don't think I want to touch incentives. On spatial planning, the group discussed in great detail how important it was to think spatially, and that spatial planning can indeed help if one can think in spatial terms about the many benefits and indeed risks which attach to particular kinds of intervention, and one can think in spatial terms about where particular interventions are appropriate, it gives a very useful basis for taking decisions. So spatial planning was one of the things which the group that dealt with impacts particularly identified as a key part of trying to get this right, while recognizing that not everything can be put on a map. Okay, and it's actually very important to recognize that not everything can be put on a map, and not everything, and even things which can be put on maps, sometimes need to be put on maps in terms other than exactly measured quantitative terms. There are many approaches to thinking in spatial terms and planning accordingly, and I would emphasize that.
Thank you, Valerie. Anyone from the panel who wants to speak about the incentives, or maybe someone from the floor, from the room? Yes, Horst?
Only because Valerie touched on spatial planning. I remember it is an incentive, a very interesting and I think challenging presentation by an Indonesian colleague last year, this year in Bonn on the REDD Plus partnership, and he said one key sentence, and this is I think something which could also stimulate your reflections, that Indonesia started to have one single map, which I think is an important step towards bringing all the different groups, all the different actors, stakeholders together and produce one single spatial map, which is, if you reach it, a fantastic step towards getting what you discuss here on the landscape level really in place. So it's a comment on that.
Thank you, Horst. We go back to the auditorium again. Yes, please. Markku Anu from Finland.
Thank you. My name is Markku Aho from the Foreign Ministry in Finland. I have one question, general question to make, but first I would really like to thank IUFRO for this and CPF for this initiative, which is very, very timely. Having been for a couple of years in this REDD Plus process myself, I think that this is the first time ever when through such a comprehensive scientific analysis, many arguments that have been repeatedly made by negotiators, stakeholders, scientific experts, is now validated and reinforced by a scientific analysis and information and policy recommendations. To my knowledge, this is the first time when we have the benefit of browsing through this type of in-depth analysis that applies a strategic approach in addition to being scientifically specific on certain thematic issues. So this is the report as such. Assessment is very timely. What is even more timely and more in demand is this approach that has been used. And on that basis, the question that I have and a proposal perhaps also is that I think we should do a couple of things to change the way how we do international policy work and also be informed through scientific analysis in negotiation. I think that that this type of analytical work that we are listening to now should be from now on. It should be in the forefront. It would be good to adopt an approach on the basis of your analysis on how to take the matters forward, have a forward-looking approach and see what are the key issues on the negotiation table in the next couple of years as after Doha and see how the scientific community, through this type of initiative, can inform policy from a strategic point of view. It would be good for us also to get this insight from you in advance, so that we know what to expect and where we can contribute to that. So that it is not only backward looking. The alternative is that you do another assessment after 10 years and see what was the outcome of this one. That is, would be a very minimalist approach. And there is actually no priority to that as compared to the forward-looking approach. So that would be the question that I have, and actually the proposal to IUFRO and the collaborative partnership on forest to take this initiative forward. And in my view, perhaps one of the best opportunity would be to adopt a governance approach as lead in this, not only thematic, in-depth analysis thematically, but from the governance perspective, because this is where, in my opinion, the biggest gap in synthesized information still is. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. IUFRO could not have done this without its donors and all the voluntary work that IUFRO rely on. Now I have hands all over, so we'll take some more questions. One there first, and then other there. So there, please. And if there's someone over there, you have to wave your hand because I have light just in my eyes. There in front. Is it possible to turn off this air conditioner? And the panel is freezing. We don't want the panel to get completely cold. Could you turn down the air conditioner? Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Edwin Osang. I come from Nigeria. I have a concern, and one of the panelists had tried to explain how REDD plus planning program should be done. I mean, just as simple as, not carrying everything together. My concern and my question is, if you don't take your time to plan, how can you make sure that all the relevant stakeholders are involved in your program or even taken care of? And in particular, what would be the guarantee that the rights of indigenous peoples and forest-dependent communities are not undermined?
Thank you. We'll take one more question. It was there, white shirt. Oh.
Thank you. My name is Lars Løvold from Rainforest Foundation, Norway. I have a comment and question to John Parata, and I would like to just join the question from the European Commission. It seems to be an excellent report, and you draw on a relationship between biodiversity, carbon, forest, and people. You provided some key messages that were very clear and very stimulating. I was looking through the report to find those key messages, and I couldn't find them. They were probably dispersed in text. So maybe you could publicize also the key messages for all those negotiators and people who don't really have the time to read through the whole thing, so that the impact of the report can be enhanced. So that's a challenge. I was surprised that nobody sort of joined the question on incentives. This report is on exactly the essential relationship between biodiversity, carbon, forest, and people. But several of us here are really concerned of the over-focus on detailed measurements of carbon emissions and sort of building an incentive structure whereby results are only measured in terms of carbon. And there is no stimulus, no incentives, no financial drive to provide incentives to poor countries to actually do, governance reform, tenure reform, protect biodiversity. So there's a discrepancy between what you have studied and the type of incentive structure that is being built through these negotiations. I would like your comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have one question over there. Yes. And then next, here in front.
Hi, this is Stella Paul, a journalist from Reuters AlertNet. I was reading the report, the second chapter of the report, which is on forest degradation. And it says that carbon emissions from forest degradation are difficult to assess because of a lack of consistent data. My question to the panelists, and anybody can answer that, considering the 42% of the total forest cover is degraded forest, seems the gap in the data is too huge to ignore. Now, what is the reason behind this inconsistent data? Is it capacity, lack of capacity on the nation's part? If yes, is there an urgent need to help countries to build their capacity to produce data that is consistent and that could be used? Thank you.
Thank you. And then up here, there was a hand. One there, and then we'll go to you. Yes, in the middle.
My name is Suleiman Yahaya. I come from Nigeria. The report is well articulated and well presented by the author. And I'm happy the panelists have also objectively analyzed the report. But my worry about all these issues is we have very good strategies, we have very good plans. And when it comes to implementation, it is usually a problem, especially in developing nations where issues of forestry, deforestation, and forest degradation is always a highly political issue. What is the international community doing to convince head of governments of the nation states, especially in the developing nations, to make sure that all these strategies we are talking about are fully implemented? Because as we are talking here in this hall, a lot of deforestation is taking place. And a lot of environmental degradation is also taking place. I'm happy one of the panelists talked about action. It should be more about action than sitting down talking. So what are we doing to convince the head of states and governments, especially in the developing nations, to make sure that all these strategies we are talking about are fully implemented for the benefit of mankind? Thank you.
Thank you. This session here is broadcasted all over, and we have people sitting watching it, and they want to put some questions to Peter here from CIFOR. So Peter, would you please take some of the questions that you have
thank you.
got?
There is one question. The call for action seems to resonate quite well on the internet, on the amount of people that are following. So there was a question from Mr. Nazi, who countered the criticism of scientists that they always needed to know everything in advance before they could go for action, where Mr. Nazi is quoted as saying, as scientists, we already know enough at this moment to be able to take action. So we are ready for action. The question from the internet then is, what action as a director of a research program, what actions as a research program are you ready to take practically at this moment?
Thank you very much. I see no more hands, and we have no more time for questions, so that's good. We'll try to get responses to most of them. We'll start with Robert, and then we'll go through the way of all the panelists and try to respond, and up with you, John Perrotta. So, Robert, would you comment whatever you find that you have time to comment on? And
okay, I thought for the last question, which is probably the easiest one, what we are doing now, we have this large program that we develop with the ICRAF, CIFOR, CIAT, Biodiversity, and a whole list of partners that where the whole purpose is to try to do something about that. I mean, sort of having the right tree at the right place in the right landscape, or having the right forest at the right place at the right landscape, and that's for the livelihood of local people. So I can tell you that, cannot tell you yet that it will be a success. We started one now about 18 months ago on this program, but I think it's a good way to integrate and to work at the different scale. encompassing issue like forestry, agriculture, and another type of land use. So I guess that's what we can do as scientists. And after, it's how we can translate our result into a policy recommendation is also something that we need to do, but it's more with other partners, like communication, outreach, something like that. I would like to just a small thing about incentive. I mean, a sort of, I guess it's incentive that has been very fashionable a few years ago about removing the perverse incentive mainly, and sort of what makes that it's cheaper to do something bad than to do it properly. And I think we are still at the same situation. It is still probably cheaper to do a very poor logging in the tropics than do it properly. So I guess we haven't removed the perverse incentive, and it's probably something that where the government, where the big donor can have much more influence than the scientist. We can tell you what you should remove, but we cannot remove it ourselves. And we should not limit the incentive in terms of money also. Money is important, but fundamentally, think about being a farmer in the deep of DRC. You earn $300 a year, and someone tells you, I give you $300 a year so that you stop cutting the quarter of an hectare that you deforest every year to make your cassava. What are you going to do? I'm going to take the money and deforest twice the size. Because what I want is to have a reasonable living. I just want to stop surviving, scrapping bits and pieces. So we have to be respectful and go with the people and try to develop common goals and then see if maybe this incentive is not about finance, it's about providing people the way to have a better livelihood in one way or the other. Finance is important, but it's not all in terms of this payment for environmental services or in terms of or this reducing deforestation.
Thank you, Robert. Valerie Kappers.
Thank you. And thanks for all those questions. There's a lot to think about. I wanted to come back a little bit to the question about degradation, which was a question about why we don't know as much as we need to know about degradation, if I understood it correctly. And I think it's partly that it's a more subtle phenomenon and it's more variable and therefore harder to study in some sort of consistent way. And that's partly about capacity, indeed, but it's also about a point that was raised, I can't remember by whom, about the issue of local conditions and the fact that both the phenomena of degradation and indeed deforestation and the drivers and the actions that we need to take need to be locally tuned, and particularly in the case of degradation, that makes it very hard to integrate what we know from lots of different local places. It doesn't mean that those local approaches aren't useful, but it does mean that when we come to do a synthesis like this, it's much harder to bring those things together. But I think the point I would make is that it's that local perception that's actually the most important part of identifying locally appropriate action. And so we're never going to get completely around those variable definitions and that variable approach to action.
Thank you, Valerie. Tasso Azevedo.
Yeah, just comment quickly on degradation. One interesting fact is that although deforestation come down 75% in the Amazon in the last 8 years, actually degradation increased. Obviously, there's two things. One thing is that before, most of the area that was degraded ended up being clear-cut later on. So it's kind of you didn't see the size of degradation because that's actually getting to deforestation. Once you take out deforestation, then you see degradation. So now you're seeing degradation in a different way. That's one thing. The other thing is, well, we improved the system to actually look at the forest through the satellites and so on. So we are seeing more than what we were seeing before. So we are actually seeing the degradation and so on. That's part of what I mean, like learning by doing. Because if we were not actually making actions and figure out how to deal with deforestation first and trying to understand all the degradation, then we will not get to understand, that phenomenon that's happening right now. Now, one thing to comment specifically, I think you have a good point. I'm the opposite of someone against planning. Whoever worked with me knows that. I'm the target guy. I'm working at everything. It's on, paper on the walls and asking everybody to have, what's your next move and et cetera, et cetera. That's not a point. What I'm saying is that you should not wait to have the complete understanding of the picture to act. If you do it, you lose it. Because once you finish to understand the whole thing, what you understand at the beginning was not the same thing anymore. So you just lose your time. You took 2-3 years negotiating. It's like this cooperation project. You stay like 3 years negotiating a project to tackle a specific problem, and then you go and then you have the, all the visits, and then you have the, there's guys that come to see if your project, you have the right outcomes, the matrix of results and so on, and then 3 years later you approve the project, and then, well, what's up is not anymore what you have to do. So I think I have to shift the mind on these things. I think this is the beauty, for example, of the Amazon Fund, which is something very simple. It says, you get some result, you get here some payment, that's it, simple as that. Now, one thing is...
Tasso, I'm getting pushed by the organizer. So
yeah, I know. But it's just that you pick, I mean, not necessarily not working on having all the steps together don't mean that you don't have the stakeholder engagement. In many ways, it's actually the opposite. For example, I know that if the people don't have access to information, it's very difficult to take part. So I can make a beautiful planning process. How I will make available all the information from the satellites and monitor and so on, make it, the whole design of the system will be perfect because we have the satellite. Doesn't matter. I mean, it's very simple. You have to take a political decision. And it's very simple for someone on the policy side to have an excuse of saying, because we have all this planning process, etc., we can't have the whole thing transparent and so on and so on and so on. No, it's very simple. You have to take the political decision. Take it and say, this will be available. And press the button and say, this is all available. That's all we have. It's not perfect. There is a lot of problems. You would challenge my information, and that's risky. But that's the decision you have to take. So what I mean by saying act is to say, don't wait for all the information. Start to move first, and the things will go, and the people will support you, and so on and so on.
Thank you, Tasso. I'll move on to Horst Freiberg. Horst, and we have to be brief.
Thanks, Tasso. He was very enthusiastic about that. I agree with you on what you said, and I think it's important really to start, but have a plan, of course. There was no specific question directed to me, but 2 points. There was somebody said, well, I don't know, act now. This is something which we know, and I think there is a lot of action ongoing, but if I listen to action, immediately in my memory jumps up the REDD+ partnership, which is the main objective which is to scale up action and finance. I think this is something which is not a top-down, but it is a bottom-up process there. And I think this is an important thing, and this is something which can contribute to this action-oriented process. And the second point, Marco called it the governance, and somebody said, well, there's also something, how to include stakeholders. Tasso said that without stakeholders, I mentioned it, it is important to bring together the local people. And I remember well Durban when our minister held a speech in the Biodiversity Partners, and we introduced there the concept of, and this fits very well into what the study also develops, the investment packages on REDD+ on a landscape level, which includes, and this I think is an important concept, where we would like to see some more on that, and we have some possibility to support that with some financial instruments which we run, to include the local people as owners of such a package. And the important word which is attached to ownership is, of course, responsibility, but also the benefit sharing aspect of any of these investments or contributions, that those who do something really receive the most of that, what they have started for. And this, I think, is very important, and this landscape approach can contribute to this.
Thank you, Horst. John Perrotta, you don't have time to respond to everything, but very brief, please.
No, there were several questions that were addressed to me, and my colleagues actually did answer many of those questions. The one that was not answered was regarding the key messages that were included in the policy brief. In fact, there are many conclusions in the main report that come from each of the chapters. These were distilled into the final chapter of the main report, the conclusions. Based on that, and very strictly based on that, we selected certain messages from those that we thought were the key ones for policymakers in particular, and changed the language a little bit for a slightly different audience. So I'm sorry if it did not come through clearly that there's a clear link between the two perhaps on closer inspection, you'll see that there is. Thank you.
This brings this session to a conclusion. And since John is looking very firm on me, I want to conclude it in 1 second. And Marco Aho, you asked us to be more looking forward, and so we could base negotiations, policy work on analytical scientific approach. And this is what IUFRO is trying to do with this summarized, and we'll try to do that more in the future together with our partners in CPF. So thank you very much for the keynote speaker, thank you very much for the 4 panelists, and thank you for all of you for coming and giving good questions.